Okay, hello there. My name's Laurie Tullock. I'm telling you about how and why the English language changes over time. This is for an A-level question about English language change over time. And I'm just going to go through it in without the actual exercises, just sort of talking to you, as it were. Hopefully, it'll be useful. It's used as a consolidation with the actual lecture if I was giving it live. All right. So what we got there is a picture of the Battle of Edington, which was in 878. It was very important, and it was on Salisbury Plain between King Alfred and the Danish King Guthrum. And the battle outcome was very important for the English language. More of that later. Okay, so where does this fit into the English language A-level syllabus? We're talking about the AQA syllabus here, and it is in the diversity and language change section, where you get a choice of two questions about different varieties of English and how language changes over time. It accounts to 20% of your mark, so it's quite important. So, first of all, we'll come back to this later on, but hopefully you'll know where all these words came from in terms of their origin, be it Latin, Celtic, or French. Okay, and hopefully over the course of this next few minutes, it'll become clear. So, how and why the English language changes over time. Um, when I was giving it to the class, it was correct answers get 2 points and incorrect get 1 point. Okay, so here's some questions for you to start off. All right, which of these words are considered correct today by the Oxford English Dictionary? He was hung by the neck. He was hanged by the neck. He was sat in the van. He was sitting in the van. Okay, they all sound quite reasonable on the face of it, but which are the ones that are acceptable? Why don't we use the term forsooth in conversation now? It was once very common. Well, that's a rhetorical question because it's pretty obvious that language is evolving. We don't use forsooth anymore because it's gone out of practice. It's just not fashionable. Okay, it's not useful. And what is ironic about the phrase "the Queen's English"? Okay, all right. So he was hung by the neck. Let's look at the answers. Right. Well, if you're from the south coast, you'd be more correct because that's considered a regional dialectical variation. Okay. However, the rest of the country, 2 marks if you say hanged by the neck. He was sat in the van. Well, northern, that would be a correct answer. The dictionary would also say, sorry, the Oxford English Dictionary would claim that both are acceptable, but sitting in the van is the one that the Guardian readers will be talking about. Okay. Um, so what is ironic about the phrase "the Queen's English"? Where we have a king now, things change, and so does language. Okay. Move on. The language has evolved and continues to evolve, right? If you're an evolutionist, you believe a language is evolving. However, we have teachers who are prescriptivist because one could claim that certain rules need to be laid down even though they are changing all the time. Like we want to see apostrophes even though they didn't exist in Shakespeare's time, but now we do. But the laws are evolving all the time. So two types of thought on this. So what gives rise to the evolutionist thought? Well, people like Jack Kerouac wrote On the Road without any page numbers, paragraphing, or punctuation, and it's considered one of the great works of literature. Punctuation, there's none in Last Exit to Brooklyn. It's a fantastic story, and award-winning Hubert Selby Jr. No punctuation, he just wrote it. Ulysses, one of the great historically sort of important novels of the 20th century. There's no punctuation at all in the last chapter. It was considered unnecessary. Somehow, all these authors luckily got them past the publishers. So, Old English, 500 to 1100 AD. Okay, so 500 to 1100 AD. What did we have before the Romans? Well, we had the Brittonic or Celtic languages, and we had the Pict language. Um, as you can see, the Celtic language spread across France as well as Spain and through England. But Scotland itself, though it's not shown on the map there, it was what we consider Pictish in its language. Now, of course, the Roman influence for 500 years, which was 55 BC to 410 AD, would have influence in terms of the Latin variation, and you see a lot of Latin in our language as a result. Okay, so Latin, it says left little behind once Romans are gone, but it has had a great influence on our language. But also Anglo-Saxon was coming in from Germany, coming in from the Frisian Islands, tribes of Germanic peoples, the Angles, the Saxons, the Jutes, who migrated to Britain in the 5th century. And all this language come together would be known as Old English. Okay, so if I was to ask you what two languages can you specify as existing in pre-Roman times, hopefully you would say, okay, yeah, Brittonic, Celtic, okay, and Pictish. The Latin came along with the Romans. All right, so the Battle of Edington, why was this important? Well, it was 878, Romans have gone, but Britain is, or England is being threatened by the Danes and the Vikings, okay? And as you can see, well, my head is in the middle of it, but there's a map of England below me there, and the red portion is that owned by King Alfred, and the whole green northern part is the Nordic armies. Okay, King Guthrum of the Nordic armies, the Vikings. And it came to a head at the Battle of Edington on Salisbury Plain. There you can see it in the top right. That's the Westbury White Horse. That's the hill fort on the top. The blue is King Alfred. The red are the Vikings. And that's the battle between the two. King Alfred won. And as a result, the English language was maintained. Old English was maintained. Well, who came along in 1066? It was the French, of course, and William the Conqueror and the language of government and laws. So that's why we say from 1100 onwards, we get the Middle English. Okay, 11 to 1500, the Norman conquest of 1066. Um, Obviously, a strong influence of French on the English vocabulary. Okay, and it became the language of governance. So a lot of the governing words were French. Okay, but English absorbed a lot of the French language. Okay, that's a picture of the Bayeux Tapestry, which was the battle. And of course, it was King Harold that got the arrow in the eye. So Middle English is 1100 to 1500. Now this is the language of Geoffrey Chaucer, of course. And there you see the introduction to the Canterbury Tales. What's that in translation? Let's go. If Yeah, it's not letting me go back, but sufficient to say that was the language of Geoffrey Chaucer. Um, and then we move on to early modern English, which is really 1500 plus. Okay, so now we're talking the language of Shakespeare, of Milton, Ben Jonson, Philip Marlowe, all the great playwrights, and we're beginning to get standardized spellings. And of course, it's here that Queen Elizabeth is sending people like Francis Drake, as you see in the picture, to sail the seas and colonize other countries, and as a result, spread the English language across the world quite effectively. Um, you could argue, of course, that Sir Francis Drake, was in fact boarding French and Spanish ships and creating mayhem. But at the same time, he was considered, well, a knight, worthy of a knightship. Knighthood, sorry. Okay, well, let's look at those words again and see whether you can tell whether they're Celtic, Latin, or French in origin. Remember, what I would say is that the Latin words tend to be 3 syllables or more. The French tend to be the words of order and government, and the Celtic tend to be single syllables. Have a look. I'll give you a minute or so. In fact, you can, of course, pause the screen, so I'll go straight into it. Alibi is Latin. Government is, not surprisingly, French. Carpe diem, okay, 4 syllables, but Latin. Dad, single syllable Celtic. Army, 2 syllables, but also the language of governance, French. Facsimile, 3 syllables, Latin. Impromptu, surprisingly, Latin. Mundane, Latin, even though it's 2 syllables. Cuisine, okay, well, that's French. You may have noticed it sounds French. Single syllable bog, Celtic. Single syllable clan, Celtic. Literature, what could that be? Well, it's more than 4 syllables, but it is also the language of order. It's French. There you have it. Okay, so quick quiz for you. Old English, when was it? Okay, here we are. 500 to 1100. Middle English, when was that? Okay, hopefully you got it right, because it's 1100 to 1500. Battle of Edington, when was that? 878. Battle of Hastings, obviously, 1066. 5 language influences. Can you think what those 5 language influences are? Yeah, okay, hopefully you got Celtic, hopefully you got Pictish, then there's the Latin of the Romans, then we got the French and the Anglo-Saxon. There we have it. Okay, well, hopefully, now what I did with the class is move on to a Socrates quiz. That won't really be available to you in this particular lesson, but hopefully that will give you an insight into the evolution of the English language through Old English, Middle English, and what we consider relatively modern English from 1500 onwards. Okay, well, thank you very much.